Hi. Well, if you've been studying along with us, we have just found out something very important. And that is that the earth isn't flat, it's round. If you've been on our studies, we just finished about Christopher Columbus discovering the New World. Well, while he was discovering the New World, there was another guy, and his name was Nicholas Copernicus. We're in lesson 94. Well, during this time, there were new ways at looking at the world. New ways, new lands to discover, like Columbus discovered. New art that was more realistic, like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. There was new architecture, as in Notre Dame, the tower there. And there were new ways of seeing the universe. And there was a few men that really dared to look up to the skies and examine what was going on in the universe, in the night sky, that it wasn't exactly what they thought it was all of these hundreds of years. You see, it's so wonderful when we find out something that's so magnificent as how God created the heavens and the earth. And the Bible says the heavens declare the glory of God, and their expanse is declaring the work of his hands. Psalm 19:1. So sometimes, I go up to my top deck and I look and I see there's such beautiful nights. And sometimes, do you play dot to dot with those stars, wondering what kind of constellations you can make? Huh? Or maybe you try to follow the Big Dipper all the way down to find out the North Star, that star which was on the compass of many, many explorers. Or maybe the unusual moments when you're seeing a lot of falling stars, meteors falling, and wondering what is going on in the heavens. Or maybe you're just thinking as you're laying there, what did people hundreds or thousands of years ago, what did they see in the sky? Did they see the same things that we're seeing at night? Those questions about the night sky have been around for a long time. I never thought when I was a young girl that we would go to the moon. I thought there was a man in the moon, but the man in the moon was just, when I looked at the moon, it looked like the moon was smiling or something. But in my time, the first man that went to the moon. The cosmonauts in Russia went, and they said, nope, there's no God up here. And then we had Neil Armstrong looking up in the astronauts as they went to the moon saying, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. As they look back on the magnificence of what God created on earth, seeing God up there in the midst. You see, that has been a question for many, many, many hundreds and thousands of years. During my time there, the movies came like Lost in Space and Star Trek and Star Wars. Some of those are my favorite movies even now. And the cartoons, of course, were the Jetsons, that they lived in space. And I thought, would we ever live in space? So I thought about those things. But then when we go back in history, the history that we're studying right now was about a man named Nicholas Copernicus. That's probably what Nicholas thought too when he looked up there at the sky. He probably thought, what really is up there in the night sky? Is God there somewhere? Just like we think. But Nicholas was that was his big hobby, was looking up there, and he saw some unusual things that didn't agree with the ancient philosophers and the way the church said that the heavens were. Most people believed in Aristotle, and Aristotle was in ancient Greece, and he believed that the earth was motionless, and that the heavenly bodies all moved around in different spheres around the earth, like different balls of globes. But there were some things that were a little bit unusual about that theory. And then Ptolemy of Alexandria, of Egyptian, in 100 AD, he believed that the orbits that the planets went around were he saw these planets that they had their own hard shells and they revolved around, and he believed that the universe was relatively small, and that beyond the stars lay these rotating spheres that drove all the other spheres, and these spheres were driving other spheres around our night sky. That's the way. They didn't really understand gravity back then. And this really didn't explain the irregularities of the planets, because some of them seemed to move backwards and some seemed to move forwards. And of course, they didn't have a telescope to really see. They just saw some stars were moving around up there. And then there was some as a Pythagoras, and he was a Greek, and he was a scientist and a mathematician in 500 BC, and he disagreed with Aristotle and Ptolemy. Well, of course, he lived before Ptolemy, but he believed that the Earth, the Sun, and the planets rotated around a central fire that was in the middle of the universe. Well, we know that that's not totally true, but at least he was looking in a different direction and trying to examine new thoughts. Then we have Aristarchus of Lamos, and he lived 310 BC to 230 BC, and he believed the sun was the center of the universe. And Archimedes agreed with Aristarchus, and he was relating to all of his writings and also believed that the earth rotated on an axis. Of course, Ptolemy had disagreed with this whole thing and disagreed with Archimedes and Aristarchus, which were way before him since he lived in 100 AD. But then we have 1,300 years later. That's a long time later. And we have the life of Copernicus. Let's think about some things in his life and what Copernicus was like. Well, Copernicus was born in 1473, a long time after these other astronomers, as I would call them. He was born in Thorn, Poland. Copernicus, his mother and father were financially successful. His mother was the daughter of a successful merchant, and his uncle was the bishop of the Roman Catholic Church, one of the bishops so a very, very important priest. Nicholas was taught at home as a boy, but when his father died, his uncle, the bishop, looked after him. And so he had the money to go to the universities back then, and he went to the University of Krakow in 1491 for 4 years, and he studied. Do you think he studied astronomy? No, that wasn't a study. He studied church law. They called it canon law. So he was studying kind of to be a priest someday. And then he started pursuing astronomy as a hobby because one of his friends in college was a so-called astronomer, Dominic Novara. And he was looking at the stars and examining the different movements of the stars. And Copernicus kind of liked this hobby, so he took it in as a hobby. And he started to learn star maps as fun, just for a fun thing to do on the side. So then, as time went on, with his uncle's assistance, he received an appointment as a church canon. That's a study of church law. And he moved to Italy. And he also studied medicine there at the University of Padua in Italy. He got his degree in canon law and at the University of Ferrara in Italy in 1503. He also became a famous artist, and he painted a really cool self-portrait so we know what he looked like. And he practiced medicine. And in the medical, he was very good. He could have been considered a doctor in this time. But he wrote a paper on his hobby. He started writing about his hobby. But first he wrote a paper on reforming the monetary system of the Catholic Church. That was not a good thing to do. He didn't totally agree with all of the canon laws, even though he had studied them in fully. But let's go back to his hobby. His hobby was to study the heavens at night. So at night he'd go and look at the stars. Now in those days we didn't have a telescope to look through, so he just looked with his bare eyes. Now he was hooked in exploring the heavens above. This was the big hobby that we know him of. It was his life hobby that he did. And he made calculations about the movements of heavenly bodies. He was familiar with Ptolemy and the Greeks Aristarchus, and he felt Ptolemy and Aristotle were totally wrong in their idea about the 80 spheres. He thought that was way too complicated, and that the sky wasn't that complicated. But Aristarchus thought the sun as being the center, and the earth revolving around the sun worked much better. And no one at that time was dare to suggest this, because everyone believed in the church that the earth and we were the center of the universe. But he said, something is a little strange here. It looks like the earth is revolving around the sun, and that the universe is much larger than any of the scientists had believed before. He was reluctant to publish his ideas, of course, at first, because here he was so involved in the church, and the church would be in total disagreement, as he knew. And he had probably talked to some people, and they said, "Don't you dare present that to the church or the Pope. You'll be considered a heretic." So he didn't, but he kept studying, because he was into church laws, and he knew that it would be a problem. But in 1543. You see, he was 70 years old then. He had finished writing his book on the revolution of heavenly bodies, and his book was laid in his hand. He was very sick and he was dying, but his book was done. Maybe he just waited to that last moment because he didn't want to hear from everyone saying that he was a heretic, but it would be okay after he was dead. I don't know. But Nicholas Copernicus was correct about the sun and the planets. And later on we see in 1609, Johann Kepler demonstrated that planets do revolve around the sun in elliptical orbits. And Galileo in the 1600s, not too far, used a telescope for the first time. Actually, he developed the telescope in a new amazing way so that he could confirm Copernicus's book. Copernicus was mistaken about a few things. He thought the sun was the center of the universe, motionless. And now we know that the sun is just one star in this huge, gigantic universe that moves through the universe. He didn't see that. Of course, he only had the bare eye. He didn't have a telescope then. And he continued to believe that there were spheres of motion that held things in orbits. He didn't understand gravity. Of course, now we know and understand gravity by other scientists that from way later, like, Einstein, And he believed that planets were circular orbits. And of course, later on, Kepler proved they weren't circular. They were like ellipses going around the sun together with the earth. This was way different than they thought with Aristotle, and nobody dared to take Aristotle and say that this just didn't happen. This impact was huge. Let's take a break.